They were like zombies and we killed them all, 100%. In a trench, the one with more grenades usually wins. The trench assault is, I think, the most difficult task in this war. This is a real science.
The conflict in Ukraine is very much a 21st century war, with the deployment of hypersonic missiles, thermobaric bombs, suicide drones, and the threat of the use of tactical nuclear weapons.
But one tool remains as important as it did on the Western Front of 1916. That is the spade.
The first 48 hours of the full Russian invasion of Ukraine in February last year suggested there would be a swift victory for modern mobile warfare and overwhelming odds. But the Russian thrust at Kyiv was halted and ultimately defeated by a combination of intense artillery bombardments and modern Western anti-tank weaponry, such as the Javelin. The Russians withdrew from Kyiv at the end of March, and the conflict entered a new and more static phase, one that would be very familiar to those who lived through or have studied the events of the early 20th century: trench warfare. This had already been going on here in Donbass, hundreds of miles to the east of Kyiv, since 2014, when Russian-backed separatists declared their own breakaway republics. Today, 17 months after the full Russian invasion, the Mail team has been given unprecedented access to trenches and other dug-in positions along the Donbass front line, from the Bakhmut sector to Liman. But why is the trench still so important in this conflict? Why does the lopata, as the spade or shovel is called in Russian and Ukrainian, remain the soldier's best friend? The principle of trench warfare is relatively simple. A soldier wants to put as much missile-proof material between himself and the enemy guns, while still being able to participate in the battle. The simplest, quickest, and cheapest way to do this is to dig a hole in the ground and position yourself inside it. If you adapt that approach to the needs of a platoon, who can also stay in close contact with each other, you require something a little larger than a hole, a trench. A battalion or a division of soldiers requires a trench network. Trenches allow troops to hold ground or provide cover when assaulting an enemy, whose firepower is likely to inflict serious damage or defeat them if they remain in the open. Such warfare has been the subject of scientific study and improvement since the 16th century, when trenches and earthworks were built around besieged cities to provide the attackers with cover from defensive fire as they got closer to the walls. It reached its apogee during the Great War of 1914-18, when industrialized firepower in the form of the machine gun and howitzer had far outstripped any advances in the mobility or personal protection of the common soldier. After initial and very costly battles of maneuver, opposing armies were forced to dig in and face each other across no man's land, behind barbed wire defenses. The advent of the tank, the development of military aviation, and the success of blitzkrieg tactics in the Second World War seemed to spell the end of trench warfare. But this was not to be. The Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s ended in a stalemate of trench warfare, of bloody over-the-top infantry assaults. Today, in Ukraine, we see something similar. The trench network of the Western Front stretched almost 500 miles from Switzerland to the sea. In Ukraine, the trench networks wind even further across this vast landscape. It is a sign of deadlock. From the start, the Ukrainians have been at a disadvantage in numbers of soldiers and quantities of heavy weapons. Their air force is also severely outmatched, but the Russians do not have total air superiority and have lost large numbers of attack helicopters to Ukrainian air defense. This spring, anticipating the Ukrainian summer counteroffensive, the Russians constructed vast new trench networks, protected by minefields, in the areas of the front line they considered vulnerable. On the other side of no man's land, the Ukrainians have also been bolstering their defences. One of the diggers is Maxim, a 36-year-old soldier from Lviv, who has been in the Donbass front line for 5 years. He explains that these trenches were dug just behind the front line, because there had been intelligence of an imminent Russian attempt to break through in this sector. He says digging in dry sand is preferable to hard ground or mud, and it is always better when you can dig away from direct fire. If the ground is too hard, or mechanical diggers are unavailable, soldiers will often first use explosives to soften it up, but they will always finish the job with shovels.
Or something like another situation, we must have second way. That's why we build this trench. Now there is good for us, good ground, because it's a sand. It's not difficult to use scaffold. It's better for us. Trench is very important for our war. We have one way for save our lives and our weapon and take our position is only trench. We built it as big as possible because if you have big trench, you have big life.
Do you enjoy digging trenches when it's 30 degrees?
Oh, it's hard work. All this weapon explodes underground. You know, as if you will be lower, it's much safety for you, because all parts what fly over from explodes fly in different size. But if you will be lower, it's fly under head, but not in your head. It's no matter what is the caliber or kind of weapon. It's the same principle. You know. If you love your country, you must die for this country. You must make that enemy guys die for his country, something like that. You must every time be alive.
This is Oleg, who is a sergeant in the Ukrainian armed forces. For the last 15 months, he's been fighting in the Donbass front line. Much of that time, he's either been living in trenches or he has been assaulting Russian trenches. I was interested when Oleg was driving the other day, when he said, well, yeah, the Russians are pretty good at making trenches. They have the book, they have their manuals, the doctrine of how to make a trench.
In general, the construction of trenches is a science. A lot depends on how you build it. A correct trench should go in a zigzag pattern, observing the required distance. Even small trenches, as deep as a hand, the Russians dig them correctly. They have already learned how to do it. At the beginning of the war, they were digging just to dig, but now they're building them very properly. Proper passageways, proper foxholes.
But the daily shelling by each side of the other's trench lines is mentally wearing for those underneath it.
Yes, not everyone can stand it. When you live in a trench for a long time, you know that approximately when and what kind of shelling will occur, and how to react to this or that sound. For example, a tank is the most dangerous because the sound of a shot is not heard. A shell arrives immediately. But you get used to everything.
Of course, to win this war, one side must leave the safety of their own defence works and attack and defeat the enemies. The soldiers tell us that the two sides have displayed very different offensive tactics.
The trench assault is, I think, the most difficult task in this war. The positive result of the assault depends, in my opinion, on 2 points. The first is preparation for an assault. Before entering a trench or any position, a lot of artillery, mortars, and in some cases aviation is used. That is, the more you iron the opponent in the trench, the more you demotivate him. I have had cases when artillery shelling lasted 40, 50 minutes, an hour, and you simply cannot raise your head. Many people are shell-shocked. The planning of enemy trenches is studied, where exactly the dugout is located, possible escape routes, etc. A lot depends on how the artillery works on the enemy's logistical routes to prevent them from bringing the ammunition. Sabotage groups work at command and observation points to cut off communication between enemy units. This is a real science. Each assault operation is very carefully elaborated. The battle in the trench is very tough. In a trench, the one with more grenades usually wins. but a properly constructed trench, a zigzag, reduces the explosive effect of a grenade. Movement along the trench is often complicated by its small width. Fighters often interfere with each other. Care should always be taken to avoid friendly fire. There's no panic in such cases, but the adrenaline can sometimes lead to mistakes.
He says the Russians he has defended his trenches against use very different tactics.
In Bakhmut, we often cross paths with Wagner. Their tactics are completely different from ours. As I have already said, our artillery and mortars work first on the enemy trench, and then special forces and infantry go in. But the Russians sent in their infantry first, like a wave of meat. I saw the weapons with which these first groups marched. They had weapons from the 1950s, covered with rust. It was very strange to watch the half shell-shocked people who came forward towards us and shot at us without hiding. It was disturbing to watch. There should be some instincts, some thoughts about one's own safety, but there were none. They were like zombies, and we killed them all 100%. After that, the second group followed, the third group, the fourth group. Only after we have destroyed these waves did they use artillery on us.
One weapon that the soldiers of the Somme did not have to contend with, that makes life in the 21st century trench more dangerous, is the drone. These machines, often armed with grenades or mortar bombs, are able to loiter over an enemy's trench, from where their operator can identify individual soldiers as targets, or call in pinpoint artillery fire. Sergeant Lahija says that this drone threat is psychologically very stressful.
The main thing is not to panic. I've developed an automatic habit when I hear something, see something, or very often only feel that something is wrong. Then I look for possible means of hiding. Of course, there is fear. Many things that are in the sky you simply cannot see. The first time you hear the sound of a drone, it is very scary. You get to know or sense that they are around, and they are almost always there.
Our present for Russian.
Shooting down Russian drones and other low-flying enemy aircraft is one of the jobs of this frontline air defense unit, although they sometimes engage ground targets with their autocannon. We come across them and their ZSU-23 armoured vehicle while they were concealed under walnut and cherry trees at the edge of a meadow that is covered with poppies and other wildflowers. A Ukrainian howitzer a few hundred meters away is firing shells over our heads into Bakhmut. The anti-aircraft gunners, all wartime volunteers from Kharkiv and ranging in age from 19 to late 40s, are in the process of finishing a large communal dugout. They know all too well the perils of Russian artillery fire. Ivan, 45, a welder in civilian life, suffered ligament damage when he tripped in a trench while under artillery fire. His comrade, 37-year-old Alexander, a meat processing worker, suffered shrapnel wounds to his legs in another bombardment. They talk to us about everyday life in a trench or dugout.
До всього привикаєш. Питаємося собі все одно, що робити удобства.
How do you keep clean?
Сухий душ продається в пачках, водою заливається, як салфетки.
Of course, there are no toilets in a trench.
Та ні, це не проблема. Туалет не проблема.
In general, it's simply a hole in the ground, which is, after that, we cover it with soil and that's it. In most cases.
Унітазу нема, звісно.
Of course, we don't have the toilet seat.
Ivan misses his wife's borscht, which she cooks for him every day at home. Here, they take turns to cook meals for each other.
По можливості,
Yeah, the one
по ситуації.
who can handle this particular duty at the moment. Yeah,
Ну, звісно, да.
yeah, sure. We try to cook.
The stove is important, but the spade more so.
Коли ти знаходишся, коли по ти починає прилітати, і тобі є рядом лопата, це є можливість врятувати своє життя. Тобто, чим нижче ти зариєшся в землю, тим є більше варіантності спастися.
In the autumn of 1918, the Allies broke through the Hindenburg Line at the Second Battle of Cambrai, and the war was over within weeks. Now the Ukrainians are probing the Russian lines for a decisive breakthrough. They are finding that it is easier to defend a trench line than to attack it. Which is why the hymn to the spade continues to be sung by the ordinary soldier.
Today, in this war, this shovel is your first friend, and the ability to use it saves your life. It gives you confidence that you have some chance. It is the best survival weapon for today. Before, I could not imagine that I would love this thing so much.